$160 million worth of the most advanced computer chips on Earth vanished from the United States and ended up headed straight for China. Not through a cyber attack, not through a warehouse break-in, not through some elite hacking crew you'd see in a movie, through paperwork, through a fake brand name scrawled on a sticker that didn't exist anywhere on the planet until these men invented it. And by the time federal agents finally caught up with this operation, the smugglers running it were so deep into their own confidence that they walked directly into a government sting and paid the United States government a ransom in cash to get their own smuggled chips back. That actually happened. That's not the trailer for a heist movie. That's a real federal case the Department of Justice unsealed, and once you understand exactly how it worked, you're going to look at every single one of these China chip export headlines completely differently. Because there are actually two things colliding in this story, stacked right on top of each other. And that collision is exactly why this case matters so much more than a typical smuggling bust buried on page 6 of a business section. Stick with me to the end, because the twist in this story is genuinely one of the strangest things I've covered on this channel. And I want one word from you when we get there. Caught or clever? You'll know exactly which one you believe. Let's get into it. Here's why any of this actually matters before we go further. The chips at the center of this case, Nvidia's H100 and H200 processors, are the exact hardware powering the global AI race right now. A single one of these chips can cost tens of thousands of dollars, and stacked together by the tens of thousands. They're what trains the AI systems that companies and governments believe will decide who leads the next decade of technology, and possibly military power along with it. Selling the most advanced versions of them to China without a special government license isn't a customs technicality. It's a federal crime, treated with roughly the same seriousness as smuggling restricted military hardware. Because in the eyes of the US government, that's essentially what these chips have become. Here's the headline version first, because the raw numbers alone should stop you. $160 million in Nvidia H100 and H200 chips, roughly 7,000 individual processors, $50 million in financing traced directly back to companies in mainland China, $1 million paid as a ransom, straight into a bank account secretly controlled by federal investigators. 8 months, start to finish, before the whole operation finally collapsed. Those are the numbers. Now, let's actually walk through how it happened, because the mechanics of this scheme are almost unbelievable. It starts with a single businessman in Texas named Alan Hao Hsu, 43 years old, based just outside Houston, running a small company called Hao Global. Starting in October of 2024, Hsu began placing chip orders with Lenovo, the massive computer company that also happens to be one of Nvidia's authorized sellers. Here's why that matters. Nvidia doesn't sell most of its chips directly to end customers. It sells through trusted partners like Lenovo, who are supposed to independently verify exactly who's actually buying the hardware before the sale goes through. Hsu's very first order was 60 Nvidia H100 boards, worth almost $11 million. He told Lenovo's compliance team the buyer was based right here in the United States. That was a lie. The real buyer was a company in Shenzhen, China. And that first shipment left a Lenovo distribution center in North Carolina, got driven to New York, flown to Singapore, and then on to Hong Kong. And at no point along that entire route did a single red flag stop it. It worked. On the very first try. The money funding all of this wasn't coming from Hsu's own pocket. Investigators eventually traced more than $50 million flowing in from Chinese companies, routed through a maze of intermediaries across Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and Taiwan, before it ever touched Hsu's accounts. This wasn't one guy running a side hustle out of a garage. This was a financed, organized pipeline, built specifically to move chips the United States government had explicitly banned from export. Then Hsu got greedy, and that's exactly when this story stops being a paperwork crime and starts becoming something closer to an actual heist. In January of 2025, a Hong Kong logistics company wired Hao Global $1.5 million as a deposit on a much bigger order: 800 H100 chips, 1,600 H200 chips, a single deal worth over $55 million. Hsu split the shipment into smaller pieces to avoid attention and tried to move the first batch through Atlanta. This time, federal agents from the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security were already watching. They intercepted the shipment on the spot. Most smugglers stop right there. Hsu didn't. He pivoted and connected with a network of warehouses in the New York City area. This is where a man named Fanyue Gong enters the story. A former IBM engineer running a small tech company on the side, Gong allegedly organized a group chat with 20 to 30 members, coordinating workers to physically open Lenovo's shipping boxes, peel off every single Nvidia label and barcode, and replace them with a brand new fake brand name invented purely to make the chips untraceable. SANDKYAN, a word that meant absolutely nothing, because nobody had ever heard it before, since the smugglers made it up themselves that same week. Once relabeled, the chips got declared on export paperwork as something completely different: adapters, simple computer adapters, then shipped off to Canada, where investigators believe they were quietly rerouted into China from there. Investigators eventually uncovered 5 separate shipments that went through this exact relabeling operation. Millions of dollars in Nvidia hardware, hiding in plain sight under a brand name that existed nowhere else on Earth. By early May of 2025, somebody tipped off federal investigators about pallets of Nvidia chips sitting in a New Jersey warehouse, waiting to be shipped to China. We still don't know exactly who made that call. But 2 days later, an undercover federal agent walks straight into that warehouse. And here's where this story turns into something genuinely unbelievable. Federal agents quietly detained every single GPU in that warehouse and physically removed them. But the smugglers had no idea the government had taken them. They believed the chips had simply been stolen. So on May 20th, someone connected to the ring reached out to the undercover agent, the exact same agent secretly running the sting, and offered a ransom: $1 million in exchange for getting the missing chips back. But first, they wanted to send a team to physically verify the chips were real before paying anything. That's when Benlin Yuan enters the picture. Yuan was the co-chief executive of a Virginia-based data center company with direct ties to a Shenzhen-listed firm whose actual clients include some of the biggest tech companies in China. Yuan organized a team, including several of his own employees, to inspect the chips before the ransom got paid. On camera, federal investigators watched Yuan's own team walk directly into their own trap. They opened boxes labeled SANDKYAN, compared the contents against reference photos of genuine Nvidia hardware, and confirmed everything checked out. Satisfied, someone on their end wired $1 million straight into a bank account controlled by the United States government. The very next day, the smugglers showed up with 3 semi-trucks to collect what they believed was their hardware. Federal agents were waiting. Every single chip got seized on the spot. Now let's be precise about what genuinely happened here, and what didn't, because both the panic and the dismissal you'll see floating around this story online are each missing real pieces of it. Here's what's true, and it matters for keeping perspective. 7,000 chips is genuinely small next to what a serious frontier AI lab actually needs to train a real model, which typically requires hundreds of thousands of chips working together. This scheme, however clever, was never going to secretly power the next major Chinese AI breakthrough on its own. That's the honest, unglamorous truth underneath the dramatic headline. But here's what genuinely justifies taking this case seriously anyway. Analysts who track this space closely point out that quantities like these don't need to reach a frontier lab to matter. They're far more likely headed towards smaller research institutions or military-linked end users running smaller-scale simulations, which in some ways is a more concerning outcome than a corporate lab quietly getting extra hardware. And this wasn't remotely an isolated case. Court documents reference other shipments tied to a completely separate vendor in Massachusetts, someone entirely uninvolved in Hsu's operation, apparently running the exact same playbook through the exact same warehouse network. Independent researchers who study chip smuggling say cases like this one are almost certainly the visible tip of a much larger, mostly invisible trade, run by ordinary trading companies that quietly realized reselling banned chips is simply more profitable than whatever their business used to be. So here's the honest scoreboard on the loophole itself. And it's worth sitting with for a second, instead of just moving past it. Nvidia says it primarily sells through well-known, trusted partners who work with the company to follow every export rule. Lenovo says it maintains a rigorous, industry-leading compliance program and fully cooperated the moment this came to light. Both statements are technically true, and that's exactly the problem. Nvidia can run a flawless process on its own end, but if the company actually reselling the chips downstream isn't asking hard enough questions about who the real buyer is, the entire safety net has a hole in it anyway, and nobody further up the chain may ever find out until federal agents show up at a warehouse. One independent policy researcher who studies this exact space put it about as plainly as anyone could. Nvidia could be doing everything right on paper, but if the company actually building and shipping the server isn't doing real due diligence, Nvidia genuinely isn't the one to blame for what happens next. The real question is whether companies like Lenovo are doing enough. And here's where the two shocks in this story actually collide, and it's the part almost no coverage connected properly. On the exact same day the Justice Department announced this bust in December, the White House announced it would now allow Nvidia to legally sell H200 chips to approved buyers in China. The very same chip model these smugglers spent 8 months and $1 million ransom trying to move illegally. Something that was a federal crime in May had become a legal transaction by December. Read that again, because it's not a typo and it's not a coincidence buried in the footnotes. The chips these men risked prison for are, right now, legal to sell to the exact kind of buyer they were smuggling them to. And if you think that means the pressure is off, there's a more recent detail worth knowing. Reporting this year, citing a senior official inside the Trump administration, suggested a major Chinese AI company may have trained its newest model using Nvidia's next-generation Blackwell chips, which remain fully banned from export to China under current rules. Blackwell is Nvidia's most powerful chip lineup to date. If that reporting holds up, the smuggling trade didn't stop the moment H200 became legal. It simply moved up to the next chip on the list, the one that's still against the law to sell. Meanwhile, the team responsible for catching the next version of this exact scheme is smaller than it used to be. Reporting from earlier this year revealed that officials specifically focused on slowing China's access to advanced technology have been pushed out of the Bureau of Industry and Security, the very agency that ran this entire sting, and there's been a steady exodus of staff from that bureau since the start of last year. There's also a bipartisan bill sitting in Congress right now that would financially reward whistleblowers for reporting export control violations like this one, similar to how whistleblower programs already work elsewhere in federal law. Right now, someone who reports a scheme like this gets nothing for it except knowing they did the right thing. Researchers who track this space argue that without a real financial incentive, most people in a position to notice something like this happening are simply never going to make that call. Let's talk about what actually happens to the people behind this, because the legal fallout is its own part of the story. Hsu already pleaded guilty back in October and faces up to 10 years in prison, along with fines against Hao Global worth up to double whatever profit the company made off the entire scheme. Gong and Yuan have both pleaded not guilty, and are heading toward a jury trial in Houston, where Yuan could face as much as 20 years and Gong up to 10, if convicted on the full range of conspiracy and export violation charges against them. Nvidia, for its part, disputes how much of a real risk cases like this actually pose to its business, pointing out that China already has domestic chip alternatives available in massive quantities, and that secretly assembling a real functioning data center out of smuggled hardware without any official technical support if something breaks is both extremely difficult and extremely risky in practice. Let's bring this together, because individually these are just numbers, but stacked on top of each other they tell you exactly what's really going on. $160 million in smuggled chips, 7,000 processors, $50 million traced back from China, $1 million ransom paid straight into a government account, 8 months from the first shipment to the final bust, 20 years, the maximum sentence Yuan is facing if convicted, 10 years, what Hsu already agreed to as part of his guilty plea, 0 days, the gap between this bust being announced and the exact same chip model becoming legal to sell. Individually, these are just numbers about court documents and stockrooms. Together, they describe a system that caught one operation, got lucky on the tip that exposed it, and is now watching the exact same playbook potentially move one chip generation further up the ladder while its own enforcement staff keeps shrinking. If this video actually helped you understand what really happened here better than the headlines did, hit subscribe right now, because I'm tracking exactly how this trial, the next chip generation, and Washington's export rules keep shifting in the months ahead. And you don't want to find out after everyone else already knows. Drop a comment with one word: caught, if you think this exposed a system that's actually working. Clever, if you think this exposed a system that just got lucky once. I'm reading every single one of them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.